Well, good afternoon. Wow, geez. Well, I think you should all get up and excited because we've got history here today. We are in the presence of wonderful people, and from my standpoint, one of the thrills I have had today, aside from seeing all your beautiful and wonderful faces, is to be able to interact with Ambassador Young. I hope you'll get that same sort of thrill. This has been one of the folks who've been a hero to me, and it was wonderful when I heard that we were going to be able to host Ambassador Young here this afternoon. Let me start by giving a special thanks to Austin Cooper and Kevin Peterson, two folks who join us today, and you'll hear a little bit more from Kevin Peterson from the New Democracy Coalition, who was instrumental in helping us put this together. I want to thank them certainly for providing us the opportunity to make this happen today. Let me also give some congratulations to the Boston University chapter, the NAACP, our International Students Consortium, our Student Union, our Departments of African American Studies, Political Science, International Relations, and our own Howard Thurman Center for making sure that we could make this happen. I don't have the honor of introducing our esteemed guests. I'm going to turn that over to some students to make sure they can do that. But first, I should say this week is Ambassador Week, and Ambassador Young is kicking this off for us. It's my pleasure to introduce one of the students around here who makes things happen, Mr. Bilal Bilici, who is a senior in our College of Arts and Sciences studying economics and also president of the International Students Consortium. And he is going to talk to you a little bit about Ambassador Week. He'll turn it over to our student who will introduce the ambassador. Bilal?
On behalf of the International Students Consortium, we would like to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Young to Boston University. We are honored to be a part of this organization and of the Ambassador Week. This week is starting with Ambassador Young's lecture, and it will continue with the Central Asia Forum. And we are hosting Central Asia Forum on this Thursday, November 16th. And 4 diplomats and 4 ambassadors will be coming to Boston University this Thursday, November 16th. I would like to invite my friend Tanya, the president of NAACP. And Tanya is a junior in the Sargent College of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences, and he's the president of Boston University chapter of NAACP. Tanya. And all of these events were a big collaboration among different departments and student groups. And we appreciate Dean Elmore, who is our big mentor, making these kind of events happen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As he said before, my name is Tanya Bascom, and I'm the current president of Boston University's NAACP chapter. Before I introduce our guest speaker this evening, I would first like to give you a little insight to the background of a man who has given so much to humanity. A pastor, a civil and human rights leader, a former member of Congress, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young began his career in public service in the 1960s as a close associate of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. During Dr. King's tenure as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Ambassador Young served as the organization's executive director and vice president. He organized many of King's famous marches and was with Dr. King at the time of his assassination. Ambassador Young continued to play a vital role in the civil rights movement after Dr. King's death. He serves as on the board of the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change. In January of 1977, Ambassador Young was appointed U.S. representative to the United Nations, and he remained in this position until September of 1979. During that period, he was also a member of President Carter's cabinet and the National Security Council, and was also the U.S. representative at many international conferences. During his 8-year tenure, beginning in 1982 as mayor of Atlanta, the city enjoyed unprecedented economic success with an addition of 100,000 new jobs. He also assured that this economic growth was shared among all levels of society by conducting 30% of all city business with minority-owned businesses. Currently, Andrew Young is a chairman and co-founding partner of Good Works International. He now travels extensively around the world to meet with officials and influential individuals interested in improving economic conditions in Africa and the Caribbean. Ambassador Young has headed numerous missions to the continent of Africa and continues to energize an extensive network to facilitate new business developments. On our home front, Ambassador Young is actively involved in trying to honor our Dr. King's legacy with a memorial in Washington. This memorial will be built roughly a half-mile from the Lincoln Memorial, where Dr. King gave his historic I Have a Dream speech. This will be the first honor to an African-American civilian in the mall. Now, it is a pleasure and an honor to have Mr. Andrew Young as our guest at Boston University. Please stand with me in welcoming Andrew Young at this time.
Thank you very much. It's really and truly a pleasure and a challenge to be here with you. I spent a summer here as a student in 1950. I took a concentrated course in physics, a whole year's physics in one summer. And it was because I had goofed off too much in the previous years at Howard University, and I was trying to catch up and graduate on time. But I remember very fondly my wanderings around Boston. I grew up in the Congregational Church, so I've always heard about the history of Boston. And to be in these old churches and to sit on the mall and listen to the Boston Pops. They had not torn up the Charles River back then. It was a beautiful Sunday afternoon place to walk. But altogether, my experience here was a very, very good one. It made me study, for one thing. But people I met, both here and at Howard, and later on in seminary, basically gave me my education. And I say that because as I look around here, we could almost, well, I like to take it back a generation. If we looked at the grandparents of each one of us, we would probably represent almost as many nations as are in the United Nations. If we looked at the kind of cultures that have come together to make America what it is. And that's one of the things that Martin Luther King was trying to get America to understand and celebrate. It's still one of the constant struggles. But I want to take just a minute because there was a young woman who worked with me at the United Nations who was a great advocate of human rights, of civil rights, of community development. She personally took on the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, saying that development can't work from the top down. She was insistent on development from the bottom up. And Ruth Morgenthau passed this weekend. And I wonder if you would just allow me and join me in a moment of silence and tribute to a woman who lived for 75 years, and surely 60 of those years were devoted to fighting for the rights of others. And she worked with me as one of the deputy ambassadors at the United Nations, and actually, she invited me here with Jimmy Carter. And I think one of the things that made Jimmy Carter president was the fact that he was well received by liberal Massachusetts as a Southerner. And that, in large measure, was because of his sensitivity to the questions of race and class and human rights, which in 1976 was still not a part of our political thinking. May we bow for a moment of silent tribute. Amen. When I read about Jeffrey Sachs' millennial village concept, I'm almost certain that he got a lot of those ideas from Ruth Morgenthau. And it's not what you do sometimes that changes the world. It's also what you think and what you say and those whom you inspire. Oprah Winfrey was at the dedication today for Martin Luther King, and she was saying that as a 16-year-old in high school, she went to an assembly program unprepared for the afternoon algebra exam that she was supposed to take. And Jesse Jackson challenged everybody to a level of excellence and not compromising on your abilities and your skills and your vision, but really pursuing exactly who you are and what you think you believe in, regardless of who else thinks it or agrees with it. And she says that was an epiphanal moment for her, because she vowed never to go into another exam unprepared and to pursue everything in life with a determination that her life depended on it. Of course, that's the way Martin Luther King lived his life. And it didn't always work out easy. It was never even partially understood. We were laughing and joking because he got a C in public speaking at Morehouse, and also a C in preaching, either here or at Crozier Theological Seminary. And his life was not a life of popular celebration. His death was, but when he went to Montgomery as a 25-year-old to try to find a quiet place to complete his dissertation, which he was pursuing here as a student of Boston University, he selected Montgomery instead of Atlanta or New Orleans or a larger church in New York, because he wanted a quiet place where he would not be involved and where he could focus on his dissertation and his studies. God gave him that time, but he had not mailed his dissertation back. I mean, the month he mailed his dissertation in, Rosa Parks sat down in the bus. And at 26, he was elected to head a movement. And he was elected at about 7 o'clock in the evening. And a mass meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock. And people were already filled in the churches. And he had no time to prepare what he was going to say. And he was caught in the trap. How do you keep people who have suddenly awakened to their own sense of dignity, their own sense of humanity and pride in respecting and demanding the respect of Rosa Parks? How do you keep them enthusiastic and committed, but not let them get so enthusiastic, so emotional, that it erupts in violence? He was already pretty much committed to nonviolence, even though that was not necessarily being taught even at Boston University. We were still being taught Amo Brunner and Reinhold Niebuhr and the German theologians that came out of the Second World War, where people were so upset about what Hitler had done to the world, there was a feeling that being nonviolent was cowardice. And against all of the intellectual and political trends of his time, he stood up before a crowd of oppressed people who were tasting the joys of freedom for the first time in their lives. Freedom not in their lives, but in their minds. And if you don't get free in your mind, you'll never be free in your life. But they were determined to sing together and to walk together and say, before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave. And he had to define that moment. A few months later, his home was bombed. And it was even more pressured because this is 1955, 56, just 10 years after the end of the Second World War. So everybody in the South had guns. The South was never and is not yet nonviolent. And people, when Martin's home was bombed, people showed up with their guns. And they were ready to do battle. And here's a 26-year-old talking to the veterans who had risked and given their lives in Europe and in Japan, and then come back to Alabama and be treated worse than they were treated in Germany and Japan. To not have the rights that the German prisoners of war had in Alabama. And they were the ones fighting for freedom all over the world, so they were ready to go to war. And this young man stood up and again defined the moment as a time of reflection. And he said, we must not follow the Old Testament route of an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, because then we'll end up with a nation that's totally blind and toothless. We must find a more excellent way. And that way is to overcome our enemies, not by violence, but by understanding. Not by hatred, but by love. You have to overcome their fears by appealing understandingly of their insecurities and overcome their fears and help them. He quoted often from Frederick Douglass that the struggle for freedom in America is a struggle to save black men's bodies and white men's souls. He carried around in his briefcase almost the whole time I knew him the Howard Thurman Negro Spiritual speaks of life and death. And he understood the spirituality of oppression. And he understood that the fight was not just a political fight, nor an economic fight. That essentially, if you wanted to change the world, you really and truly had to reach into the hearts, not only of your people, but of your enemies. Now, everybody, including his father, thought he was crazy. Because Daddy King always had a gun. Daddy King didn't get rid of the gun until almost 65, when Martin finally prevailed upon him that he didn't want any guns around the house. And so this was not a context in which religious people abhorred violence. This was a typical American context that understood the gravity of the situation and realized that violence would destroy America. And the only reason America doesn't look like Beirut, the only reason the America that you know didn't go through the kind of trauma that Yugoslavia went through in Bosnia and Serbia and Macedonia, the only reason we did not have a Rwanda where hundreds of thousands of people would be massacred on an occasion was the clear voice of nonviolence of this young black man. Now, that's the reason I know you're proud to have a black man's stature on the mall around all these white men. But that's not the most significant thing about it. The most significant thing about it is that George Washington, Lincoln, really held America together by violence. And Jefferson never quite got it right. He had all the theories, but in terms of delivering, he kind of was wishy-washy about both the freedom of all Americans and also the means of pursuing that freedom from the British. But Martin was very, very clear. And he is the only American voice that has been willing to stand up and say that either we must learn to live together as brothers and sisters or we will perish together as fools. And he was able to develop, thanks to Mahatma Gandhi, who pioneered in the tactics of nonviolence. But remember, India was a majority, and the British troops were a small minority in India. We, on the other hand, were a small minority in the midst of an overpowerful, the most powerful nation on the face of the earth. And to assume that nonviolence could work in India was one thing, but to assume that it could work in the South was another. I was in a conference in Indiana the next summer after I left here, 1951. And the only other black person in that conference was a fellow by the name of Eduardo Manlani. And he ended up coming there from Mozambique and was getting his PhD at Northwestern University. And we both ran across this little book, Nehru on Gandhi, in the bookstore there at the church conference. And we were only two black folk there, and he had a way of drumming on a book. But we read it and we discussed, and he was convinced that because blacks were a majority in Mozambique, that this would work in Mozambique. And I was equally convinced in 1951 that this would never work in the South that I grew up in, that neither blacks nor whites would be able to be restrained enough not to be violent if there were confrontations ever came. And so, as it turned out, when Eduardo Manlani went back to Mozambique and organized demonstrations, the Portuguese machine-gunned the people who were demonstrating. And so they took to the bush and ended up starting a violent revolutionary movement. We, on the other hand, were spared that, not because we were any smarter or the U.S. Southerners any better than the Portuguese, but because of the sweetness and the depth of spirit and the character of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks actually was a seamstress who did sewing for most of the white families in Montgomery. So she knew white people very, very well. She did not want to hurt any white people. She just wanted respect. And the difference between people marching in an open confrontation in the beginning and people withdrawing their support from the buses is quite significant. If Martin had called for a big protest and a couple of thousand people had showed up on the steps of the Capitol in Montgomery, in 1956 they might have been machine gunned too. But the act of withdrawal of support, Thoreau's notion that non-cooperation with evil is as powerful, as important as is cooperation with the good. And so this was a non-confrontational way of building up both the confidence of the black people of the South, but also easing the fears of the white people of the South. And because of the character, you know, the irony of it is these were all Christian folk. They all read the same Bible. They understood the prophets, that the hungry must be fed and the naked must be clothed and the sick must be healed. They understood the notion, how can you love God whom you have not seen if you don't love your brother whom you have seen? These were the Bible verses that people recited around the table in Southern Sunday dinners. And so this was a culture that had much in common. We all sang the same hymns. I remember the first time I integrated a Presbyterian conference center in North Carolina. There'd never been any black folk there before. And my wife and I decided, well, they invited me to speak, so we decided we were going to go there and take our family and just integrate it. Well, when we got to the kitchen and we went down the cafeteria line, there was fried chicken, black-eyed peas, corn on the cob, sweet potatoes, green beans. We said, look, golly, they want us here. They fixed our food. And it never dawned on me that white people eat the same way as colored people. But there was so much in common there that as we gradually confronted the problems of human rights, we began to realize that we must do it together. Now, my experience started in Thomasville, Georgia, and it was with the Ku Klux Klan. I was asked to run a voter registration drive, and about 400 Klansmen showed up on the outskirts of town. Well, I figured they were coming after me, and I was still, you know, from this Reinhold Niebuhr school of negotiating from a position of strength. And I was married to a little country girl who could shoot a rifle very, very well. And so I got out the rifle, and I said, when these people come here to try to intimidate us, we were an old beat-up parsonage that if they'd thrown a match on the front porch, it would have gone up in smoke. And I said, I want to go down and talk to them, but I want you to keep the rifle on the guy I'm talking to, so that if they grab me, you take him too. And if you deal that way, then I can negotiate from a position of strength. Well, she said, no, I can't point a gun at a human being. Well, when we were courting, she'd put tin cans up at 50 feet, and she'd turn and shoot it. She could shoot birds for food. But she said, no, you don't point guns at a human being. And I said, Lord, have mercy. What are we going to do about this? Well, it just turned out that some of the elders in the community knew what to do about it. They went first to the corporate leaders of that community, Thomasville, Georgia. It was Flowers Bakery and Sunnyland Packing Company. And the corporate leaders went on the loudspeakers in their plants and urged their workers, black and white, not to be involved in the Ku Klux Klan rally because it's bad for business. And they then, the corporate leaders, called the sheriff and said, you keep that Klan right down there in front of the courthouse and don't let them march into the black community. Let them have their rally and then get them out of town. Well, that taught me another lesson, that enlightened self-interest is one of the best protectors of the human rights of all of us. And so from that time on, I've always worked with the business community. When we went to Birmingham and started demonstrations, we would march in the morning, and then I would put on my suit, march in my overalls, put on my suit. They wouldn't let me go to jail because I had to go down, and they said, Tom. Well, I called it reason. But somebody had to go down, and we got the Episcopal Church to bring the business community together. And we sat down and we reasoned about this problem. And I began to realize that I didn't have to bargain for any of my rights. I had to make them secure in their rights. I had to help them to see that the fact that black people were able to eat at a lunch counter or work in their stores was not going to hurt their business. It was, in fact, going to help their business. In fact, none of the things that have happened in the South would have happened if we had not been able to encourage a nonviolent civil rights movement. In fact, when I became mayor in Atlanta, it wasn't 100,000 jobs. I know it's hard to believe it. But in 8 years, we generated 1 million new jobs. Atlanta grew from a little over 1 million people. Now we're about 4 million, 4.5 million. And during that period, it was because we had the proper human rights environment. We not only brought black and white together, but because the government had run out of money, we went to Japan. We went to the Middle East. We went to Europe. And we brought in 1,100 international companies into Atlanta in the 8 years I was mayor. And it was $70 billion worth of private investment and 1 million new jobs. And we made sure that those jobs were available to people regardless of race, creed, color, or gender. In fact, the only requirement was that you had to open these jobs and contracts to all of our citizens. That, as a preacher, that's the way I saw that the hungry could be fed. That's the way I saw that we could wipe out poverty. And we were able to do that to the benefit of white and black alike. And so human rights, instead of being threatening, turned out to be very, very much a blessing. And Coca-Cola, of all places, realized that. The president of Coca-Cola had been in South Africa in the 40s when South Africa instituted apartheid. And when he came back to Atlanta, Atlanta didn't want to recognize Martin Luther King after he won the Nobel Prize. And J. Paul Austin, the chairman of Coca-Cola, said, look, Coca-Cola can't stay in a city that is viewed as discriminatory of colored peoples. Most of the people that drink Coca-Cola around the world are colored people. And if it looks like we're discriminating against colored people, you put Coca-Cola out of business. We can't stay here if you're going to have this kind of bigoted attitude and refuse to honor a Nobel Prize winner in your city simply because he happens to be a man of color. And that combination of the business community and the human rights community has always been a part of our strategy for social change and the development of human rights. Now, Jimmy Carter was an outgrowth of that. Jimmy Carter grew up in South Georgia, but it just happened that the county he was in was 80% black, and that his mother, as the only healthcare professional in the county, delivered all the babies, black and white. And she considered all of them her children. And so she watched them and she encouraged them and she treated them like they were equals. There was also a Methodist bishop who lived next door to his grandfather, who was the only black man, the only person in town that had in the county that had a car. And this black bishop had a big Packard. And so the bishop and Jimmy Carter's grandfather, who was a Southern populist, would sit on the porch. There wasn't any television, there wasn't much radio. And so on a Sunday afternoon, even though one was black and one was white, they would sit on the front porch and read the Bible and sing hymns together. And so Jimmy Carter grew up with black people, but with black people not just as servants, but black people as equals and black people as even having more wealth than his family. And that made a big difference. Not putting down the Kennedys because we owe a whole lot to them, but they never had any black people that they had to look up to until they got in public office. And they learned, and they learned very quickly. But with Jimmy Carter, it was second nature. And it was also easy for him to understand that the basic problems that threatened the world were race and poverty. That almost everything we're talking about nowadays, call it terrorism, call it what you will, it's all rooted in the disequilibrium of freedom and opportunity for human beings. And in Latin America, you can't have one group of people owning all the land. The ambassador of Rwanda was coming here, and I hope he forgives me for saying this, but in Rwanda, it was almost tall people versus short people. In Liberia, it was the American families of African descent that went back, and they created a class system and only allowed the native Africans who didn't come back as slaves, they could only rise to the rank of sergeant in the military. They didn't have a right to public education. Education was something for the families of these 400 families that had come back and taken over this country, and really they set up a colonial model. Well, eventually, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Rwanda, poor people got tired and rebelled. And when poor people rebel, they're always encouraged. In Bosnia, once the yoke of Soviet domination and communism left, people began to blame their situation on one another. And demagogues emerged to blame someone else. Hitler did it to the Jews. And I thought we should have answered the brother from Iran when he said that there were 60 million people killed in the Second World War. What's so special about this 6 million? Well, what's special about it is that these were killed by their own government. The Germans bombed England in an act of war. We were involved in acts of war with the Japanese and did some very terrible things. But those were in acts of war between nations. In Germany, it was the persecution of the very people who had been in many ways responsible for the success of the nation. And that kind of internal human rights breakdown is always the seed of additional destruction elsewhere. And so the sooner you can begin to get a handle on these social inequities, the sooner we can have peace and stability and progress and prosperity. Rwanda now has come back. They wrote a constitution, probably the most progressive constitution on the planet, because nobody can win an election. The president says, if you have winners, then you have losers, and losers always create problems. So no matter how many votes you get, each party gets 50% of the vote, of the appointments, and 50% of the seats in the legislature. And it's a constitutional requirement that 30% of those seats on each side be held by women. When they actually developed their government and included talent and merit in a quota system, they ended up with a government that's 48% women. And they did things differently. They immediately said that everybody in our society has to have a chance. And so public education is free for everybody up through 10th grade. And they began to say, we've got to take care of the health of our children and our mothers. And the quality of life in Rwanda 10 years after the genocide is probably ahead of almost any other country in Africa, including South Africa. And as much of a miracle as that is, I still worry about South Africa, that some of my friends who were in jail 10 years ago are now actually billionaires. And they've forgotten that the people who were responsible for them while they were in jail still are living in shanty towns. And they haven't found a way yet to make education free in South Africa. They haven't found a way yet to narrow this gap between the haves and the have-nots. And the thing that worries me most on the African continent now is not AIDS. AIDS, I think, we will deal with, as tragic as it is. Still more people die of malaria than die of AIDS. And we could do something about that. In fact, if we could provide clean water, which is very easy to do and would only cost a fraction of the amount of money that all of these foundations and the US government have set aside to deal with AIDS. If we provided clean water for the continent, we could rid the continent of some 41 diseases. And while we're looking for a silver bullet and something to treat the AIDS question as we wish and need here, really Africa's problems are far more complex. And the human rights of Africa are going to depend, as they've depended here, on a broad-based development strategy. But a strategy for equality is absolutely necessary to contain the hopes and aspirations and to stifle the fears and insecurities of people in one-body politic. And that's why I think the Portuguese say, a luta continua. The struggle continues. We in the civil rights movement used to sing an old spiritual, we've struggled so long. Freedom is a constant struggle. We've struggled so long that we must be free. Freedom is a constant dying. We've died so much that we must be free. And the idea that we will never reach the promised land on this earth, but that we will always need to continue to be sensitive to the inequities, not only in our society, but around the globe. I like to remind people that we didn't kill anybody during the 4 years Jimmy Carter was president. And no American killed anybody. And no American got killed for 4 years. And yet, we had a disarmament treaty with the Russians. We stopped wars in Southern Africa, and we started Zimbabwe and Namibia and South Africa on the road to freedom. We negotiated peace and prosperity for the people of Panama through a Panama Canal Treaty. And still the only place in the Middle East where nobody is killing anybody is between Israel and Egypt. Since 1978, no Israeli has killed any Egyptian, and no Egyptian has killed any Israeli. And that didn't cost a whole lot of money. It only cost the determination of Jimmy Carter to sit Sadat and Begin down. They wouldn't even sit together. One was in one house and the other was in the other. And Jimmy Carter ran back and forth between the two of them until he got a treaty that they could all agree on. And yet, as fragile as that treaty was, it has prevented violence and bloodshed between Israel and Egypt since 1978. And so when we talk about Martin Luther King's nonviolence, when we talk about the possibilities of nonviolence around the world, we're not talking about cowardice. We're not talking about soft power, as Ken Nye calls it. We're talking about real spiritual power. John Bryan, a friend of mine, says all the time that, well, he quotes this from Deepak Chopra, I found out, but that we think of ourselves as human beings that have occasional spiritual experiences. In fact, we are probably spiritual beings having a human experience. And if that's the case, the most powerful thing in our lives is the human spirit. And as we exercise, as we develop, as we become more sensitive to the powers of the human spirit, we will see the powers of the human spirit in those who are less fortunate. We will see the powers of the human spirit even in our enemies. And we'll realize that with our enemies, or with those with whom we seem to be of different colors and culture, we have so much more in common than the things that separate us. If we got people together in Antarctica, in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, and in North America, and if we did a DNA sample, the differences within any group would be greater than the differences between any of the other groups. We are essentially a human family. And the challenge for us is to develop a social and an intellectual order and a spiritual order that appreciates the value and the virtue of every human being, and to do it without the destruction of either person or property. Very few people have been able to do that. Gandhi did it and held India together and got them free. But as soon as he died, Nehru wasn't a believer. And so once Gandhi was gone, India split into India and Pakistan. Martin Luther King held us together. And fortunately, nobody has totally rejected nonviolence domestically. In fact, everybody believes in a domestic context of nonviolence in this country. And we've made it work through our elections and through our legislatures and our courts. But it comes from the values of our churches and synagogues. And I think ultimately, this is a cosmic battle that we wage within our own souls. And as we wage it within our own souls, and as we win one at a time, because I never got angry with the Ku Klux Klan. I never got angry with the businessmen in Birmingham or the police in Birmingham or even the people who beat me up in St. Augustine. I knew they didn't know any better. And my father raised me to believe that racism is a sickness, and you don't get angry with sick people, you help them. But I get angry with my wife. I get angry with my mother. I lose my temper with, not my daughters are perfect, but my son. He is so much like me, I hate him. And he can push certain buttons, and I'm just now that he's 33 and I'm 75, that I'm just getting to the place where we can sort of be men together. And I don't want him to try to be like me, and he doesn't want to be like me. He wants to be like him. But that's the lesson I learned here at Boston University in 1950. I was here because my daddy was trying to make me a dentist. And I didn't want to be a dentist. And I didn't know what I wanted to be. But he never gave up. Even when I was sworn in as ambassador to the United Nations at the White House by Thurgood Marshall and Jimmy Carter standing there, he came up and shook hands with them. And they said, "You must be really proud of this boy." And his answer was, if he'd have been a dentist, he'd have been somebody. I say that because the hardest and most difficult areas of nonviolence are in our personal lives. It's understanding and forgiving and being open to new truths from those that are closest to us. And as we do that, and as we do that with our enemies, we can possibly have a world of peace. And a world of peace inevitably will be a world of prosperity, because we will work together as brothers and sisters, and we will not perish together as fools. Thank you very much.
I understand we might have room for a couple of questions. I'm going to ask Kevin Peterson from our New Democracy Coalition to take the questions and answers, please. Kevin?
Let's give Ambassador Young one more.
You want to come mic so everybody can hear? Oh, she had a mic. Oh, is that not working? Come on up.
Sophia. Sophia. We'll start with Sophia, and we can exhaust the 3 questionnaires and maybe have one from the audience after our prepared questioners have addressed it.
I was just wondering, I know you had mentioned the equality between people as being the largest obstacle facing us, but I was wondering concerning the globalization of society, what do you think is the largest obstacle facing an amicable relationship between people of different communities within like a nation where equality isn't an issue? What would you think the largest obstacle facing that relationship would be?
Well, I think it's always an issue within. Where are you from?
I'm from Pakistan, Florida.
Pakistan,
Also,
very
actually,
good.
St. Augustine's my hometown.
They beat me up in St. Augustine. But that's why they welcomed you, because we got that worked out a little bit. No, globalization is a threat because it has meant and will mean the redistribution and the reallocation of jobs. But I guess I agree with Tom Friedman that there's no way to stop it, that it's not being politically driven, it's being technically driven. And I've been to China, and I've been, well, I guess one of the things I've done around the world is travel and talk to everybody I can. And actually, I think of globalization as a blessing. When I was a child, they'd tell me, eat everything on your plate. Think all those hungry people in China. Well, I go to China and everybody's working. Now, they're doing jobs that maybe used to be done in Boston, and that's a threat. But Boston is a good example. This was an area of shoe manufacture. In fact, I think this center is named for a man who made his money in shoes. Now they make shoes in China, in Italy, Latin America. But it only challenged Boston to go into high technology. And the per capita income is probably far greater here because of, what is it, Route 128? And because we have the intellectual and financial resources to step up the quality of life a notch. The fact that they're manufacturing shoes somewhere else is probably a blessing. And I guarantee you that none of you would have ever worked or wanted to work in a shoe factory. And so you got a chance, and there was an imperative to get a college education and to do specialized understandings of the world in which we live to maintain our leadership profile. And I just think that's the challenge for us. I was in China when I was mayor back in about '85, and a bunch of Chinese students, high school age, looked like they were about 12 to 15, came running across the street, and I said, oh, they want to try their English. Well, not only did they want to try their English, they really wanted to talk about the U.S. They said, where are you from? I said, Atlanta, Georgia. They said, Empire State of the South. And the young lady who was with me was from South Carolina. She said, well, I'm from South Carolina. He said, oh, you're a Tar Heel. And she said, no, that's North Carolina. It's close. Now, I've lived in Georgia for the last 50 years. I didn't know what South Carolina's, and you probably don't either. But these kids talked to each other in Chinese, and they said, is South Carolina the Palmetto State? And she says, golly, they knew so much about the U.S. Their English was so good. And these were not university students. These were high school age students. That's what we've got to prepare for. If you want to read a frightening book that'll make you work harder and study harder, read China Inc. I think by a guy by the name of Fishman, I think is his name. But he documents how the Chinese learned to distrust the law, because under communism, anything that let you survive was illegal. And so they became very skilled at bending, if not breaking, the laws to survive. So they said, how are you going to get Chinese to respect patent laws? The law for them has been a means of keeping them enslaved. So they don't see any problem in pilfering a few parts from a computer factory and taking it home, and said that people are actually making computers from stolen parts in the Dell supply chain that they are able to sell to their neighbors for around $100. Now, what's Dell going to do when these Chinese start manufacturing these $100 computers? It means that we're going to have to up the ante. We're going to have to compete. And competition is not going to be easy, because hungry folk are serious folk. And unfortunately, we are getting fat and lazy. So we're not motivated by need. We've got to be motivated intellectually and spiritually.
A question from Billy Andre. Billy, state your name, your class rank, and what where you're from.
Hello, my name is Billy Andre from the College of Engineering. I've been following the UN and their involvement during the Lebanon conflict between Hezbollah and Israel. And what I've observed during the past few years is that the UN has become less powerful in the way they deal with problems around the world, comparing to their original purpose, which was to protect the world against another world war. So pretty much my question is, as we move on to the new global era, can civil rights groups or human rights coalition depend on the U.S. to save their lives?
You made a Freudian slip. You said, can you depend on the U.S. to save their lives? No, but that's exactly the truth. If the U.S. wants the UN to work, it'll work. But if the only reason it didn't work in Lebanon was we vetoed most of the proposals. The only reason it didn't work in Rwanda was we vetoed the proposals. The U.S. or the Chinese now are stopping the UN from working on Iran. And because the U.S. uses its veto selectively and sometimes irresponsibly, then the Chinese do the same. Now, I was at the UN for 3 years. I never lost a single vote. And the reason was that I talked to people. I went to them and sat down with them like I went to white people in Birmingham and sat down with them. In fact, it turned out that the Russian ambassador had gone to Swarthmore College, and my daughter was at Swarthmore, and the president of Swarthmore had been his doubles partner on the tennis team. So we played diplomatic doubles every other week. And we never talked politics on the tennis court. But when we did have a political crisis, we were friends. And I could go to him, or he'd pick up the phone and call me. And we'd work it out as friends. The same thing with the Chinese. One of my favorite little stories is the Chinese came and nobody knew anything about the Chinese. We didn't know what to talk about. So we were talking about Chinese food. And my wife, who was from Alabama, got disgusted and walked off by herself and said, these are the sophisticated diplomats that are running the world, and they don't know anything to talk about China but Chinese food? And the Chinese foreign minister said the same thing. And he walked over and started talking to my wife and said, where do you find good Southern food? And she said, in New York, only at our house. Well, we were living on the 42nd floor of the Waldorf Astoria. And I said, baby, how are you going to get Southern? She said, no, you have to come to our house to get Southern food. So we invited all the Chinese delegation over to the Waldorf. Well, I said, you're going to get Southern food out of the Waldorf? She said, no, my mother's coming up. So her mother was almost 80. And you got a black woman from Alabama in the Waldorf kitchen with all of these chefs. She said, look, you all get away from here, give me this stove. And she fried the chicken, and she made the cornbread, and she baked the sweet potatoes, and then we had Waldorf put it on silver trays and bring it up to the apartment. And we had to figure out what to drink because the Chinese like to drink a lot. So somebody said, fix them some mint juleps. Well, mint julep is a cup of straight bourbon with nothing but syrup and a little lemon, and it looks like iced tea. But after you sip a couple of them, you get awful friendly. And so the Chinese are basically a drinking, toasting culture anyway. So after a couple of mint juleps, they ate everything on the tray. And then normally at the UN, people go home at 9 o'clock. They sat down on the floor in this walled-off apartment, and we talked about their college experiences. Everybody in the Chinese delegation had gone to school somewhere in the United States. And once I knew how well they knew us, it was very easy for me, when I had a problem with them, to go sit down with them and talk to it. And we never had a Chinese veto. Even when China invaded Vietnam, because Vietnam was attacking them, and I went to them and said, we really need to condemn this violence. And I said, I hope you won't veto it. And he said, well, if you condemn the Vietnamese, they started. I said, yeah, we're not trying to decide, we're just condemning the violence. We're not saying who's to blame. They said, well, we'll abstain. And we can't get that kind of cooperation from Ambassador Bolton, because he lectures people and he fusses at people and he acts like he's the high sheriff in the Old South. And that will not work at the United Nations. So the Democrats will probably not confirm him as ambassador. And I hope that President Bush then will send someone. His father was a very good ambassador, because his father was a good New England gentleman that sat down and talked to people like he was civilized. But the right-wing ideologues have gotten a hold of this younger one, and it really affects the way the world's running. Somebody said that Daddy Bush gave, I think it was Maureen Dowd, gave Georgie the country to play with, the presidency to play with, and he broke it. So now they're taking it back. So they brought Baker and Scowcroft in as an intellectual, neutral committee to give him some advice and ease Cheney and Rumsfeld out. And I think that's an election victory as far as I'm concerned.
Hello, I'm Francesca Coley from the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm a junior. And my question to you, Mr. Young, was, having learned of your extensive background in the Christian church, I wanted to know if you find it or found it difficult to effectively advocate human and civil rights without using religion as a moral foundation.
I don't think you can. Well, I kind of tried to do it. I'll let you know that where I'm coming from is strictly spiritual, strictly based in the Bible, mostly the New Testament, but I've been very open to the teachings of Buddha. I've tried to understand Islam, and Gandhi's, the Hindu poets were always very inspirational. But ultimately my foundation is religious and spiritual. But I tried to give an economic rationale for human rights that the business community understands. And I think that there is a political rationale also. Really, violence does not work. Wars don't give you what you want. And nobody ever wins a war. And it takes you more than 50 years to recover from a war, no matter who wins. And you don't recover unless, after you have won, you redevelop and rebuild your enemy. The only reason we got out of the Second World War without the world in shambles is that we redeveloped Europe and Japan with the Marshall Plan. And if we had continued that kind of thinking, and if instead of exploiting the Arab world for its oil, Well, for instance, if we had said to the Shah, instead of buying jets and tanks, which really won't defend you in Iran, you should be educating all Iranians, especially Iranian women. And you should be providing the health care and pioneering health care for all of the Middle East. Saudi Arabia and Iran moving in those humanitarian directions would not be threatened today, and they wouldn't be threatening to us.
One more last question.
Ambassador Young, given your background in appointed positions as an ambassador, and elected positions as a legislator, and in executive positions as a mayor of Atlanta, I'd like to know if you foresee in the future for African Americans any particular aspect of leadership to look toward, whether it be executive, legislative, or in appointed positions for moving the race more progressively.
No, I think you're going to see all three. And frankly, I was successful in all three. But in Congress, I had to get 236 people to agree with me. And I did on occasion, but it was very difficult. But I just to say comparable to this time, in 1972, I was elected to Congress. And nobody in the Congress was against the war in Vietnam. By 1974, we had cut off the bombing. And we began to unwind the country's involvement in Vietnam. But it took not only the election of my group in 72, but the next election in 74. They also impeached the president. And so I think that this election is starting a process. I don't think it'll result in any impeachment. But I think once they begin to do some serious investigations of the way this war was carried on, this war failed not because George Bush and many of the Congress who voted for it were wrong in expecting, to succeed, but the profiteers took over. And they decided they could make a lot of money quick on the war. Just little things. A group of friends of mine who have worked in the Middle East all their lives, who are fluent in Arabic and all of the dialects of the region, and who are professional educators, were selected by the State Department to go to reopen the schools in Iraq. And at the last minute, Cheney fired them and said, "We don't need you." And he sent some of his friends who didn't speak Arabic and who'd never worked in education. And then they wonder why people are not in schools. Well, the people who are planting these bombs should have been in schools. See? There was a group of Iraqi business people who came to us and asked us, would we help bring the American corporations? They wanted to bring Delta Airlines. They wanted to bring Coca-Cola. They wanted to bring Home Depot, and all of it. Those are just the companies in Atlanta, into Iraq. And they were going to select Iraqi partners for them and create jobs and put the country back to work. But Halliburton went over and said, "We don't need any Iraqis. We're gonna do all of this." See? So the people who would have been working and the people who would have been in school, the rest would have been much easier to manage. But with nobody working in a job and nobody in school, everybody's got the right to be a terrorist, and they've chosen that right. So I think we could have unseated Saddam Hussein without violence. And I went to the UN and I told Kofi Annan, or suggested to Kofi Annan, even before the election, before George Bush was elected, that you have got to move on Iraq, because if these Republicans win, they're going to start a war. And I suggested to him a plan. When I was at the UN, there were 30,000 Chinese construction workers in Iraq. And I said, you need to invite the Chinese to come back into Iraq to check on the roads. They were building roads, earthen dams, waterways. I said the Chinese in Iraq have had a very productive presence, and they have helped to build Iraq. If you got 30,000 Chinese in Iraq, we wouldn't be bombing Iraq. And I said the Russians only want natural gas. So let them take the gas through Russia. If they take the gas through Russia, it will lower the price of gas in the United States because it'll increase the supply. But then take the money that they make from the gas and use that to let the Germans and the French and the American nonprofits do the humanitarian work. That will finance the humanitarian development of Iraq. And I said, if you get all of these people into Iraq, then over about a 10-year period of time, you will gradually see Saddam Hussein's power base weaken. But it'll take time, but it still would have been quicker than the time, and much less expensive than the time that this war has taken, and it would not have made nearly the toll of death and destruction, both at home and abroad, that has been brought on by this war. Nonviolence is possible if you are thoughtful, if you're serious, and if you make it your life's work and live by that vision.
I'm going to close with very brief remarks, and they are, Ambassador Young, welcome back to your alma mater. We thank you for a wonderful speech and lecture, and we are happy, we are elated that you never became a dentist.
Thank you.
And with that, there will be a handing over of an award to you, and then I will come back and we'll close.
Well, we know that the monument to Dr. King was not here when you were here, but we want to let you, since you are someone who builds monuments, since you're someone who monuments will always be built towards, we wanted to leave you with at least our monument to take with you as well. And that is from the King Monument right at our Marsh Chapel, not too far from here. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Come on in.
One more time.
Thank you.
And just in closing, we would like to thank some people who contributed significantly to this event: Edith Goodyear, Jessica Skadowski, I'm sorry if I butcher your name, the International Students Consortium, the Howard Thurman Center, GSU Operations and Productions, and BU Today, and a special thanks to Dean Kenneth Elmore. Thank you, and have a good night.